What's the perfect follow-up to your weekly TCB fix? It could be Crime Beat. Now, people know their hometowns by streets or the local mall. Crime reporter Nancy Hicks knows hers by the crime scenes she's been to over the past 20 years, covering Canada's most high-profile cases. Journey deep inside criminal cases like you never have before on Crime Beat. Season 2 just launched, covering one of Canada's most notorious triple murders. Subscribe to Crime Beat on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
The shocking story of arson investigator John Leonard Orr began back in 1984. A fire in a Pasadena, California hardware store killed 4 people, including a 2-year-old child. Arson investigators examined the ruins and determined that the fire was caused by an electrical malfunction, all except for John Orr. He was convinced that the cause was arson. Join us at the quiet end today for the case of fire captain and arson investigator John Orr. With nearly 2,000 suspicious fires over the next 7 years, a task force was formed to find a serial arsonist. The task force called themselves the Pillow Pyro Task Force, and their methods of investigation were both fascinating and effective. So it should be a great talk today. And this case was recommended to us by Cindy.
Well, Cindy's recommended a few cases for us. She's one of our most avid listeners, so we always like to hear from her. Okay, so we have a California beer. I've never picked one from this brewery before. I can't imagine. One of my favorite breweries. I haven't chosen them. Anyway, this is from Sierra Nevada Brewing Company. It's Celebration Fresh Hop IPA. Sierra Nevada Brewing is in Chico, California. Celebration's an American IPA with a 6.8% ABV. Nice beer. Orange amber color, a little bit of head, some pretty lace, kind of a spicy aroma, peppery aroma, some sweet malt, a little bit of hops. And that's exactly how it tastes. You start out with the caramel, a little spicy peppery stuff, and then hops at the end. And it's a nice beer. It's not terribly hoppy, not one of those hop bombs that are going to kill you. So I think you'd enjoy it.
All right. Well, let's open it up.
Okay.
So I was really surprised this is your first Sierra Nevada. Let's take it down to the quiet end.
Yeah, I don't know how I've missed Sierra Nevada. Anyway, I've had a ton of beers from that company. So if we have other California cases, you'll probably see some more of them.
Great.
So on to the case. This is just a fascinating case to me.
It really is, yeah.
So by John Orr's own description, his childhood growing up in the 1950s was a happy one. He lived in a 2-bedroom, middle-class home behind his grandparents' house. He had 2 older brothers who moved away when John was a teenager, one to join the Navy and the other to start his own family. And when John was 16, his mother left him and his father alone, with no explanation. She just took off one day. She called after a few days, but John didn't see her again for 3 years. And she had moved back to her hometown in Missouri, and she never did reconcile with John's father. Well, that's kind of a strange thing to happen when you're a teen.
Sure, I'm sure it was pretty weird and a little disheartening for him.
Definitely. One day she's there, the next day she's not. And there's
Sure.
no real explanation. So in 1967, John joined the Air Force. After he completed basic training, he was in jet mechanics training. Then he transferred to firefighting school. He had wanted to be a firefighter for some time, so he was happy to learn how to operate the equipment as he put out training fires.
Yeah, he married his high school girlfriend, Jody, in 1968, and they were shipped off to an Air Force base in Spain, which was near a commercial airport. And they were there for 2 years, but John was kind of bored. He only got to respond to 2 air crashes during that time, and he really wanted to be more in on the action. When John was transferred to Great Falls, Montana, he fought only 1 fire. Then, when he was 22, he was honorably discharged. At this time, Jody was pregnant with their first child. John was insecure, and he came across as a bit of a braggart in order to compensate for this. He really wanted to become a policeman or a firefighter. The Los Angeles Police Department invited him to test for a position, and he passed the written test, the medical exam, and the fitness test, but he failed the psychological test. He was sent a letter telling him that he was unsuitable. So this was a big thing for him. He had wanted to be a policeman very badly.
Yeah, that was his main goal, to be a cop.
Yeah, so this would be pointed back to as a really huge disappointment, which really might have had an effect on who he became as a man.
Well, yeah, I think you could look at it that way. You could also look at it as there was something in his psychological makeup that made him unhireable.
Oh, sure, yeah, I think it went both ways. After getting past feeling hurt, he was very angry. The rejection letter suggested that he consult another psychologist. So he hired one that he found in the Yellow Pages. This psychologist did an evaluation and found him suitable. But remember, this is the person he was paying. But now he had a second opinion, so he took that back to the LAPD psychologist for an appeal of that decision.
Yeah, now the LAPD psychologist couldn't tell John anything specific about why he had been rejected, other than to say that he might have been too passive and police officers needed to be assertive. But then the psychologist left John alone in his office with the file. And he said, I'm going to go out and get a cup of coffee. I think he kind of intentionally left the file there. So John read the file and saw that one of his co-workers had been interviewed and told the psychologist that John was late to work, lazy, and resentful of another man being promoted over him.
So I can't see any other way that this happened than that the psychologist was really giving him an opportunity to look at his file.
Well, absolutely.
The final evaluation stated that John needed a few years to mature, and then maybe he could reapply to the force. Now, John, though, would never admit to seeing his diagnosis in that file, but he had actually been diagnosed with a personality trait disturbance and an emotionally unstable personality. His former supervisors had described him as both irresponsible and immature as well. So at this time, John was working for Sparkletts Bottled Water Company. He quit that job and entered the management program at a fast food restaurant. It was 1973, and John was going from one fast food job to another before he quit, and he applied next to the Los Angeles Fire Department.
If he couldn't be a policeman, he can be a fireman.
Yeah, I think it was his backup plan.
Right.
And he was really thrilled when he was accepted to the academy for training. But it turns out he was out of shape and he wasn't up to the rigors of the academy physically. He was told that he had also done poorly on the written test. So he was just given the option to resign or he was going to be fired. So he was very angry and upset when this happened.
Yeah, and part of his problem was probably his attitude. Because after all, he'd been a firefighter for 4 years in the Air Force. So he felt like he didn't need to study or practice. Now, his time in the Air Force, would he have a couple fires, a couple crashes? I mean, he didn't have much training, but he thought he did. So he didn't participate in study sessions with other recruits, and he hadn't practiced handling the heavy ladders and equipment. And they were heavy. These were big wooden ladders.
Yeah, apparently in the service they had the light aluminum ladders, so this was a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, he couldn't handle it.
So after that failure, John was absolutely despondent. And by this time he had 2 young daughters, and his marriage was on the rocks. That's when he applied to the Glendale Fire Department, and they accepted him in their fire academy. In the spring of '74, he had completed 8 weeks of training, and he graduated with 12 other guys. He was starting his career as a firefighter, and he was super happy about it, even though the pay at Glendale was a lot less than it would have been at the LAPD or the LAFD.
Yeah, wasn't it Glendale was the lowest paying in the state or something like that?
At the time it was, yeah.
Maybe that's why he got hired. Nobody wanted to work for them.
I'm sure that was part of it, because he really wasn't the top of the picks.
No, I mean, the psychological report from earlier says a lot, doesn't it?
It really does. And also at home, things weren't improving. He was really bored on his days off, so he ended up taking a part-time job at a 7-Eleven as a clerk. Then he bought himself a pickup truck and went on camping and hunting trips on his own without his family. He ended up befriending a woman at the 7-Eleven, another employee who was also unhappy in her marriage, and the two of them decided to be roommates and leave their spouses. And apparently this was not a sexual thing at all. It was just a friendship.
Allegedly, anyway.
Yes.
So John left his wife, Jody, leaving her just a note as an explanation for what he was doing.
Yeah, a lot like what his mother did.
Yeah. He paid child support, and he also began taking classes in fire science and police science. John believed that the police didn't show enough respect for firefighters, and he examined the conflicts between the two groups in a writing assignment. He was still working at the 7-Eleven, and he used what he was learning to help him spot shoplifters in the store.
Yeah, he got really into that. His boss at the 7-Eleven was impressed at how good he got at catching shoplifters. John would watch kids who came into the store after school, and he'd catch them, making them empty their pockets and return things. So this was a big thing for John Orr. I mean, to the point of weirdness, really.
Yeah, very weird. One example, in 1976, while he was out shopping, he saw a man running toward a car with his arms full of suits from a Montgomery Ward store. So John Orr chased the man, knocked him down, and helped the store security guard hold the man until the police arrived.
Yeah, but he was clearly thrilled with this moment. He talked to the security guards, and he actually asked them if he could get a part-time job working in mall security. But the mall said they only hired off-duty policemen and not firefighters. So there's another bruise to his ego.
That's right. He's already been told he's second class anyway, because he's a fire department guy and not a police department guy.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's really a thing, but he definitely saw it that way.
He saw a lot of things in a slightly off-center way.
That's true, he did. He wasn't quite right. We know that.
So John was disappointed that he couldn't get a mall security job, but that didn't deter him from doing other good deeds. The same day, he saw an older man shoplifting hand tools. He told the cashier and got the man arrested. So he asked at the Sears store about getting a part-time job with security. Now this time, he was told that Glendale police officers covered the night shifts, but they could hire him for day shift.
So that just thrilled him.
So there he goes.
He immediately gave his notice to the 7-Eleven and started working at Sears the following week. Now he must have really felt like a real crime fighter. He caught over 50 shoplifters in his first few months at the Sears. Plus he caught one employee who was stealing, and a husband and wife team who had over $30,000 worth of Sears property.
Well, he was worth his money, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was exceptional.
Now, he loved working security so much, he said he would have done it for free. He topped any of the other security guards, not only in arrests, but in dangerous pursuits. Now, some of these thieves had weapons on them, and John was able to get a concealed weapons permit so that he could also carry a gun.
Well, yeah, that would have made him feel more like a real policeman.
You bet.
And then he wanted to fit in with the other cops, so he started hanging out at cop bars, and he became kind of a cocky, swaggering type of guy, more than he had been. But among both the police and the firefighters, he was a little bit of a joke. He was called a cop wannabe by many of them. But he didn't know. He was oblivious and happy.
He was. John remarried in Las Vegas, marriage number 2 of 4. When he returned to work, he asked to be assigned to Hill Patrol. Hill Patrol, you drive a big pickup truck with a water tank and a pump, so he was in charge of fire inspections and preventions. Hill Patrol for John was more exciting than waiting around the station for a fire. And he even had his own vehicle, so he's out and around. Of course, he's also out and around unsupervised, and on his own. He's not responding to calls or anything. He's just out there acting to prevent things, right?
Right. inspect, prevent, handing out summons, which became a problem with him, citations.
There are a couple interesting stories about that, him trying to serve citations to people.
Absolutely.
Which didn't go well.
There were 3 arson fires in the 1970s in Glendale. 2 of them were at Webb's department stores. The third and last arson fire was set near closing time, and John was working just 1 block over at the Sears store. Now, he would say that he saw the flames on his way home from work. Then he helped fight the fire for 2 hours, and the arsonist was never caught. So he wasn't at home much. He was working 2 jobs and taking hunting trips with another firefighter. During the hunting trips, John and his friend often picked up women, and soon the second marriage ended. He moved closer to Glendale Fire Station, and he frequented 2 local bars, almost on a nightly basis.
The good life, right? In his fire patrol job, John inspected vacant lots in residential areas. Now, he would write warnings to the property owners if they had dry brush, which posed a fire hazard. Yeah, just look what goes on there all the time now, right now in particular.
Oh yeah, it's a big thing. It's a problem, although it's certainly gotten worse now than it was in the 80s.
Absolutely. John Orr also caught kids who were pulling false fire alarms, and there was a few more who were actually setting fires. And pretty much all these hill fires, brush fires, were set. Nothing spontaneous about them. They weren't lightning strikes or anything. They were deliberately set.
Well, I would imagine sometimes throwing a cigarette out the window would have been a thing, too. That started a lot of fires.
Can do.
But he got really good at getting the kids to confess, and he started to feel like he wanted to move on and catch real arsonists. So when the Glendale Fire Department was looking to hire a full-time arson investigator, John was actually the only applicant. He took more fire investigation courses, and in one class he watched staged fires where furnished rooms were set on fire, and students could watch how the fires progressed, and then they could examine the aftermath of the fire. And the fire marshal couldn't help but notice John's enthusiasm. So he gave approval for John to go out after hours on unusual fires and start learning more about investigation.
I think we mentioned this, but he had gotten into trouble a few times for being overly aggressive in serving citations. So he requested that he do ride-alongs with the police so he could improve his technique.
Well, that was the reason he gave, but I think he just really wanted to ride around with police and get involved in that kind of stuff.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
So in the early 80s, many of the Glendale hillsides were being set on fire. Property owners were responsible for cleaning up brush, but they didn't always do it. John started calling brush cleanup companies posing as a property owner and making appointments for the land to be cleaned up.
Yeah, so that got him into some trouble when that got found out.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So his enthusiasm just made him seem like kind of an oddball to some of the other firefighters. He was going to all brush fires while he was on the clock and even on his days off. He wanted to put together an arson unit, and then he wanted to start doing some arsonist profiling. So he was fascinated with that. At a small brush fire on the hillside, John was able to trace the fire's path to a bush that looked like it had exploded. And in the bush, he said he found the remnants of a matchbook and cigarette delay incendiary device. This arsonist wasn't caught, but John got a lot of praise for finding that device, which will make you go, later on.
Mm-hmm. Like that?
Yeah.
Okay. The first serial arsonist John Orr caught was a mentally ill woman who had set a series of small fires on the property of a nursing home community. He noted that 2 of the fires could be seen from the woman's window. John told the woman that someone had seen her set the fires, and the woman promptly confessed. Well, that was easy.
Yeah, so he'd learned some kind of police techniques, right? That seems more like a policeman thing than a fireman thing.
It does. Despite that good beginning, his career took a blow when he tried to give a citation to a property owner who hadn't cleared the property after several warnings, because this property owner was a very wealthy guy who was friends with the mayor. So he called the mayor, the property owner, and the mayor called the fire chief, and the fire chief called the fire marshal, and then John was called into the fire marshal's office and told he needed to be more careful with how he treated wealthy, influential people.
Oh, and this really set him off.
Yeah, he couldn't believe it. So he got so pissed off that he withdrew his application for the arson investigator position.
Yeah, he actually had to take a little time off work. He was so angry. Why should anyone be treated any different? Why should I bow down to these people? They're no better than I am. Very fragile ego.
Very. So after this, John was just an ordinary firefighter. And during this time, there happened to be an increase in arson fires in Glendale. And when the fire chief was ready to select an arson investigator, he asked John to reconsider and reapply. If he took the new position, he would have real authority, and best of all, he'd be allowed to carry his gun.
He loved that.
That's a big deal for him. So he quickly agreed, and he ended up getting the job.
Yeah, so for this he was teamed up with a police detective, and together they made up the Glendale arson team. The Glendale Fire Department joined a union and actually became one of the highest paid departments in the state after that. He and his partner were given an office and a used Ford with a red spotlight and a police radio. So he was pretty thrilled with all this.
Oh, definitely.
It made him feel important. So the first pyromaniac who John caught was a bystander who had warned and helped out the residents in a series of small apartment building fires. And John became fascinated by pyromaniacs. Now, actually, less than 5% of arsonists are pyromaniacs. A pyromaniac being a person who suffers from the disorder of pyromania. And pyromania is an impulse control disorder where the person is unable to overcome this impulse to set fires. So often pyromaniacs set fires to feel a sense of pleasure and even euphoria, and it can even sometimes be sexual, the pleasure they get from watching the fire.
I was going to ask you that, because it seems to me that that could be a part of things.
It can be, and when you get into the book that John wrote later on, his character, which a lot of people thought was a lot like him, would do a lot of masturbation around the fires after he'd set them. So it's pretty bizarre.
You can say that.
Yes.
So John wrote an article that got published in the American Fire Journal, and he was asked to submit more articles. So this is the beginning of his career as an author also.
Yeah, he was a pretty good writer, and that became a thing where they asked him to submit articles.
It's a big deal, at least to John. And he also, during this time, got married again, although he got divorced after a couple of years, so he's 3 up and 3 down right now.
Yeah.
Then he moved in with a private investigator who employed him part-time, a guy named Bill McLaughlin. McLaughlin and his wife rented a room to John in their hilltop Chevy Chase Canyon home, which happened to be in brushfire country.
Yeah, and then he began studying for the promotion to fire captain. At the time, Glendale was having more of these incendiary fires, but according to John, it might have been because he was working harder and identifying more of them. He had a growing reputation as a skilled arson investigator, and he was given the job of hosting the California Conference of Arson Investigators' 5-day firefighting exams. So pretty impressive.
It was. I mean, at first glance, it looks like this guy is really doing well.
Well, I mean, he definitely was motivated, enthusiastic, and put a lot of effort in. At the conference, he set up a live burn of an abandoned building, and this was impressive and involved over 40 people setting it up and coordinating it. So that was a big undertaking, and he was quite proud of it.
And he probably should have been. Now, on October 10th, 1984, John got to be at the biggest fire of his career. The South Pasadena Ole's Home Center had burned to the ground. The store was totally destroyed, and unfortunately 4 people were killed. A 2-year-old boy named Matthew Troidel, his grandma, Ada Deal, and 2 employees, Carolyn Krause, who was 26 years old, and Jimmy Satina, who was 17.
Yeah, so this was a tragedy. John had taken photos of this fire, which he had developed, and he showed them to the South Pasadena fire chief the next morning. By the end of that day, the LA County Sheriff's Department attended a press conference, and the fire was declared to be accidental. But this made John angry. He said he thought it was arson, and he was very critical of how that fire scene had been investigated.
Yeah, the sources we looked at seemed like it wasn't investigated at all.
Not a lot.
Once it was safe to be at the site, they were involved in cleaning it up and getting rid of all the stuff.
Right. So he said it was arson and, he would know. So in 1985, John married wife number 4. His detective partner in the Glendale arson unit left him, saying the partnership just wasn't going well. He was pretty tough to work with. In 87, beginning on January 13th, the California Conference of Arson Investigators had a 3-day seminar in Fresno. John Orr went, leaving his new partner in Glendale to run the arson unit. 242 professionals attended the conference, including prosecutors, insurance investigators, police officers, firefighters, and arson investigators, of course.
Yeah, on the first evening of the conference, just about an hour after the Payless drugstore had closed, an employee saw smoke coming from a sleeping bag display, which was packed tightly into a cabinet. According to the employee, he saw the sleeping bags burst into flames. This set off the internal overhead sprinklers, and the store manager put out the fire with the sprinklers and this handheld fire extinguisher. So fortunately, most of the damage was water damage. Now, the store manager ended up getting fined because his fire alarms were not working correctly.
A witness at the drugstore reported to have seen a deaf-mute or maybe an arsonist pretending to be a deaf-mute in the area where the fire originated just a short time before the sleeping bags burst into flames. But it was overall a minor fire and it didn't get a lot of attention. At least not until a fire across the street 2 days later. Now this fire was on a Thursday at Hancock Fabrics, directly across the street from the drugstore that had been on fire on Tuesday. The first witness was a woman who had been shopping at the fabric store and looking at some fabric at the center cutting area. She looked up and saw smoke in the corner of the store. It was gray smoke, but it turned black and then ignited into this big ball of flames. And this fireball climbed up the walls and to the ceiling incredibly fast. A warning of fire came over the intercom and things were crazy as customers and employees ran for the exits. The first witness believed that keeping the doors closed after their exit would starve the fire of oxygen and slow it down until the firefighters could get there. But this was a roaring fire. The woman was actually putting all of her weight against an outside door when she was thrown back into the parking lot by a blast. So that's how powerful this fire was.
Pretty strong fire.
Yes. So whoever's setting the fires knew what they were doing.
Right.
And this was so bad that firefighters didn't even attempt to enter the building because all the people were out, fortunately. So they fought the fire from the outside, an intensely hot fire, and the origin was found to be a storage bin filled with styrofoam. But, thank God everyone escaped the fire without injury.
Styrofoam and these sleeping bags and pillows and all these things are stuffed with basically petroleum products.
Yeah, which is terrible.
So
has that changed, do you think?
Incredibly flammable.
Yeah. It's a little scary because our houses are filled with them.
Yeah.
So the Hancock Fabrics store was almost completely destroyed, but investigators searching the area found an incendiary delay device, and this was a partially burned cigarette with a filter tip which had 3 matches attached to it by a rubber band. So that would mean that you could have the cigarette, burning, and then it could burn slowly, and when it hit the matches, you'd get your real fire. So it gave the arsonist a chance to get away.
Yeah, you could drop it, leave it, and be out of the area by the time things started happening.
Yes, so what you're looking for is someone who was there before the fire.
Now, another witness at the fabric store reported seeing a customer loitering in the area of the fire's origin before the fire started. This guy was described as a white man, around 60 years old, with a white beard, a bright yellow raincoat, and a blue captain's hat. So we've got 2 different descriptions of these. Well, they're 2 different fires, but 2 different descriptions of people.
Well, and that's how it'll be. There are a lot of fires we're going to briefly go over, and it looks like the arsonist had different clothing, and there were different descriptions, but it ends up being a serial arsonist that did all of these.
Yes.
But that goes to show you how eyewitnesses can really not be very helpful. I mean, their minds can be easily changed. They can make quick judgments. So it's really hard to get a good description of a person from an eyewitness.
It is.
So later at the House of Fabrics, just a block away from Hancock Fabrics, an employee found another incendiary delay device in a bin that was filled with foam pillows. So this was a cigarette, matches, and a rubber band. This one hadn't ignited into a fire, but it had scorched the wall a bit before it was found. So it definitely seemed like someone was trying to burn Fresno during an arson investigators conference going on there. But that wasn't the end of the spree.
No, it wasn't. In the late morning of the last day of the conference, in a town about an hour away, there was another fire. This was at Surplus City, and it had started in a sleeping bag display. And less than an hour later, another fire started at the Family Bargain Center in the same town.
Tulare. At the Family Bargain Center, a customer in the back of the store saw smoke, and the manager saw the fire in a wooden display bin stacked with foam pillows. The manager was able to put out the fire, and under the pillows he found a partially burned cigarette with a filter attached to 2 burned matches with 1 rubber band, and this was wrapped with yellow notebook paper. So putting the paper around it would delay the fire from starting a little bit and also give more to burn to get it going more.
Yeah. I mean, this way you have, besides 2 or 3 matches, you've got a little bit more of a flame with the paper.
Yes.
But you've noticed that almost all of these involve points of origin of sleeping bags, pillows, that kind of stuff, the easily flammable stuff.
Absolutely. And that will lead to the task force calling itself the Pillow Pyro Task Force. Yeah.
Now, the store manager described a man who had been in the store as a guy in his mid-20s in a blue jacket and jeans. The man had entered the store about 15 minutes before the fire started, and he had been holding a yellow piece of notebook paper similar to what was found on the incendiary device.
So that's a little bit better than just the description of a person. Having someone holding that paper makes it much more of a clue for me.
Yeah, doesn't it?
At 2 p.m. that same day in the city of Bakersfield, which is just an hour south of Tulare, an employee at a craft mart saw smoke and flames coming from a bin in the center of the store. The manager put out the fire with an extinguisher, and the fire department was called out. Fire investigator Captain Marvin G. Casey of the Bakersfield Fire Department was called out to that scene. He had extensive training as well as almost 20 years of experience. He found the incendiary delay device, which was again a cigarette, matches, and yellow lined paper. It was handled with a set of tweezers and put into an evidence bag. The notebook paper was from a regular old legal pad, so they compared it to any paper that was present in that store, but it didn't match. They didn't have anything like that there.
And that same afternoon, at the Bakersfield Hancock Fabrics store, a sales clerk was helping a very pregnant customer when she smelled smoke. There was no smoking allowed in the store, and the clerk thought that somebody was doing that, so she went away to find whoever was smoking. And she did see a man browsing in the fabrics who was wearing a cowboy shirt and boots, and she estimated his age of 30 to 35 years. His hands were empty, and she couldn't find anyone smoking in the store.
Yeah, I think it's really hard to guess someone's age if you just see them walking by, and then you're asked later.
Yeah.
But less than 30 minutes after that, the clerk had heard a hissing sound coming from the back of that store in the area of the foam rubber stuffing. She saw a small blue flame, followed by a large ball of fire that quickly just climbed right up the wall, and it was surprisingly fast, really scary.
Fires can do that.
Yes. Now, fortunately, the sprinklers were set off and the fire was extinguished without anyone getting hurt, but the incendiary device was the same as the others. The suspect descriptions didn't really match at all, though. All of the fires in Fresno that week occurred right near Highway 99, so it seemed that the arsonist had been in Fresno Tuesday through Thursday and had then driven to Tulare, where he set 2 fires. Then, maybe after taking a lunch break, he had set 2 more fires in Bakersfield that afternoon. And after that he was gone, no more fires.
Now, because the fires were in 3 different cities, the ATF was called in. And the evidence that was sent to the ATF's lab in Walnut Creek was examined by a former NYPD policeman and fingerprint specialist, Special Agent Clive Barnum. Partially burned yellow notebook paper was treated with ninhydrin, and it revealed a fingerprint. This had 13 points of identification. Now, the FBI would accept 7 points of identification or better to prosecute a suspect, so this looked like a very good clue. They've got pretty much a complete print.
Yeah, strong print.
Yeah, let's get them.
So this fingerprint was run through the state and national fingerprint databases, but no match was found. So that meant that the arsonist didn't have a criminal record. Investigator Casey had some ideas, though, about who could have set the fires. He got the names of everyone who attended the conference in Fresno, 242 names. And he ran into a little trouble with that because a lot of people in the police and fire departments didn't want to believe that the arsonist could have been someone that was at that conference. These were all pretty much respected professionals.
Absolutely. And for this guy to have the temerity to suggest that the arsonist was a fire professional, that's just unheard of. You don't do that.
Sure, and I can see that, but in some ways it does make a lot of sense because an arsonist is fascinated with fire, and you could certainly have someone working in that profession who felt that way about fire. Now, I know most firemen are just trying to help people. I mean, it's a very honorable profession. But I could see how there could be a person in that field fascinated with fire. It kind of makes sense.
Well, I think it's known that arsonists gravitate towards fire departments.
Sure.
It's where they can be in on the action more.
Right, exactly. So next, Casey researched the attendees' places of employment just to see if they would have traveled through Tulare and Bakersfield. So he was able to eliminate attendees who hadn't traveled alone either, because an arsonist isn't going to have someone with him most likely. And after this process of elimination, he was left with 55 names of arson investigators. But members of the ATF were still really skeptical about Casey's idea. They weren't very supportive. Meanwhile, John Orr is really making a name for himself among fire investigators, and he was continuing to have articles published in the American Fire Journal. He was scheduled to attend another arson investigation conference beginning on March 5, 1989, in the town of Pacific Grove near Monterey. This was the Symposium Number 4 Arson Conference, and this one lasted for 4 days.
Yeah, so many of the conference attendees decided to arrive early in order to enjoy the weekend in Pacific Grove. Well, why not? Monterey is one of the most beautiful places on earth.
Exactly. How many of us really get a chance to go there?
Yeah, so you're on your department's dime. Let's take some time and enjoy ourselves.
Absolutely.
Before the conference began, on Friday, March 3rd, 1989, at 5:49 p.m., there was a fire at the Cornet Variety Store in the coastal town of Morro Bay, which is 2 hours south of the conference. A shopper saw the fire early on and yelled, "Fire!" Then the clerk was able to put the fire out with an extinguisher. This fire had originated from a pile of foam pillows.
Not a good sign.
The next day, a Saturday, a second fire broke out in the town of Salinas, which is just 19 miles from the conference. This was at a Woolworth store, and it started in an area where the foam pillows were kept. This fire caused a good deal of damage, but no one was injured.
So the conference ended March 8th without any incident, and most of the attendees checked out that day. The following morning, 2 hours south of that conference, in the town of Atascadero off of Highway 101, an arson spree began. At 9:30 in the morning, an employee at the Pacific Home Improvement store saw a burned roll of foam padding on a shelf, and he removed the padding and found a cigarette with 3 matches attached to it by a rubber band. It was all wrapped up in yellow notebook paper. Then just 2 hours later, at 11:30 a.m., at the Atascadero location of the Cornet Variety Store, a fire broke out in the back of the store where the shelves held shredded foam rubber. The suspicious customers were a couple in their 20s and a man in his 40s. So the man in his 40s was very odd. He wanted to pay for his merchandise, even as the store was filling up with smoke.
Yeah, I can't leave yet. I got to pay for this.
Right. Then a few minutes after noon, another fire broke out at the Coast to Coast hardware store. This one was put out by an employee with a fire extinguisher as well. But all three of these fires had happened on El Camino Street, near Highway 101.
And at 7:55 p.m. that same day, 20 minutes south of Atascadero, in San Luis Obispo, the Party Exchange store had a fire, which filled the store with smoke. This time, the building was completely destroyed, and the fire was believed to have started in the area that held the combustible packaging materials. This spree included 6 fires in retail stores in Morro Bay, Salinas, Atascadero, and San Luis Obispo.
So clearly a spree by a serial arsonist.
One day, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when Captain Marvin Casey heard about the fires that had broken out before, during, and after the Pacific Grove Arson Symposium, he was more convinced than ever that his theory of the arsonist had to be correct, right?
2 instances now. We've had sprees of fire setting associated with 2 conferences. So.
But not everyone was really on board with him still. But now, after he put together a list of symposium attendees, he was able to pare it down to people who had been at the Fresno conference, as well as the Pacific Grove conference. So now, instead of 55 names to look at, he only had 10.
That's doable.
Yeah, absolutely. But these were all respected arson investigators. So that didn't go over well with everyone. One of the men on the list, John Orr, was well known to Casey. Casey had actually taken a class run by John Orr in Glendale just 2 years earlier. And before taking the class, Casey had been really excited to meet John Orr. He had become well known for his knowledge of arson investigation and was quite well respected. Even though, he was still a bit of a weird guy.
Yeah, I guess he was viewed as kind of a weird guy, but a smart guy, and you could learn from him.
Sure, and a lot of people in professions are like that, right? Haven't you met people who are just wonderful at their profession, but they're a little weird? And
Yeah.
It's almost to be expected.
Kind of socially inept and things like that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Or obsessed.
Yeah, there's lots of things. So Casey again contacted the ATF, and this time Special Agent Chuck Gallion in Fresno agreed to compare the fingerprint from the yellow notebook paper to the 10 arson investigators' fingerprint cards in the state database. And this is a database of people in public safety jobs. So these are analyzed by a fingerprint expert, but the report came back negative. No match. Now this is really pretty dismaying.
It totally was, and it would end up being an error.
It did, but we have to go through a few other things before we get to that point, right?
Right. But that's what makes it so upsetting, is that this could have been solved at this point, but it wasn't. So that May, John Orr was promoted to fire captain, and he got a significant raise. So he went right out and bought himself a new SUV. He wrote 3 pieces for the American Fire Journal, and he started considering writing a novel. He and his now 4th wife, Wanda, were happy, and life for John Orr was going about as good as you could expect.
Sounds like he's living the dream right now.
I think it was about the best it had been.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a little break here so we can talk about Madison Reed. Or actually, you can talk about Madison Reed. I will listen.
Okay, great. You know what? You can actually take coloring your hair at home to the next level with Madison Reed. Madison Reed will give you gorgeous professional hair color delivered to your door for less than $25. Now, Madison Reed hair color really is one of a kind because it's multidimensional, and it gives you your choice of over 45 multitonal shades that have all been developed by master colorists. And these people really know how to blend the nuances of cool, warm, light, and dark to get just the color you want. Many of our listeners write to me and they say, "Jill, Madison Reed has really improved my life." And I totally get it. Madison Reed delivers gray-covering, natural-looking hair color to my door just when I want it. It leaves me free from long salon visits and saves me money while leaving my hair looking and feeling better than ever. It feels soft, it's strong, and it looks natural. so I'm always happy to recommend Madison Reed to our listeners. It's very affordable, it's very convenient, and you just can't beat the quality. We're busy women, so don't we deserve gorgeous professional hair color delivered to our doors on our schedule for less than $25? Damn right we do. Find your perfect shade at madison-reed.com. True Crime Brewery listeners get 10% off plus free shipping on their first color kit by using our code BREWERY. That's code BREWERY at madison-reed.com for great hair color delivered to your house.
Thanks, Jill.
Sure, anytime.
Now we're getting back to John Orr's happy life. In 1989, there were clusters of brush fires around Chevy Chase Canyon. John Orr, meanwhile, had many complaints about his firefighter partner and about the new fire marshal. Just seemed that most people couldn't live up to Orr's expectations. He went through partners like crazy.
Sure, he did.
Now, in 1990, he began writing Points of Origin, which was his first attempt at a novel. And that June, there was another arson symposium in Fresno. This time, John decided to stay behind in Glendale, and he sent his partner.
Yes. Now, this was a hot, dry summer with temperatures rising above 100 degrees, with humidity below 10%. And to make matters worse, the Santa Ana winds were blowing at 35 miles per hour. So there were brush fires in the foothills of Glendale like there were every summer. And arson investigators hadn't been able to catch anyone who had started these fires. So very frustrating hard work. Then on Wednesday, June 27th, there was a brush fire sweeping up North Verdugo. The fire alarm was set off at 3:24 p.m. and firefighters were sent out. James Frawley, a rookie firefighter, was the second one to arrive on the scene. As he turned a corner in his truck, Frawley saw a man standing at the base of the hill where the fire had started, and the man looked like he was ruffling around going through some things. And Frawley recognized this guy. It was Captain John Orr from the arson unit. So he figured that Orr must have arrived with the first fire engine, and then he didn't think much more about it.
And Captain Greg Jones, one of the other firefighters there, actually there were a lot of firefighters there, Jones was tasked with setting up protective structures to contain the fire, and he also saw John Orr. He saw Orr standing by his white Chevy Blazer on a road uphill from him. Jones couldn't understand how Orr could have arrived at the area of the fire's origin without Jones seeing him arrive there.
Well, yeah, he pretty much would have had to drive by him.
He had to drive by him.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't just materialize.
Right.
Orr went up to Greg Jones and asked him if he needed help. Jones took him up on the offer, told him to take a hose to a house where the fire was getting closer. So then Jones turned around and was working on another house, which had its roof on fire. Then after a few minutes, Jones returned to the street, and there he saw that Orr had removed a salvage cover from the fire engine and was dragging the tarp into the house that Jones had been hosing down. This made no sense.
Well, no. I mean, protecting the contents of the house is kind of a low priority at this point, right? The attic, the roof, and all this area around it was on fire.
Sure is.
But Jones watched as John Orr covered a living room sofa with the tarp and then just walked out of the house casual-like. Then Orr drove away as embers were just falling onto the house. And he hadn't even bothered to hose down the house next door.
Yeah, that was his one task that he had been given by Jones.
Yeah, so he's really kind of helping the fire instead of trying to suppress it.
Yep. Then later that afternoon, Moses Gomez of the California State Fire Marshal's office heard the report of a fire in Glendale. He was asked to respond to a command post set up on North Verdugo Road. Now, there was a lot of traffic, so he didn't arrive there until about 6 p.m. And as he drove up the street, he saw Captain John Orr standing behind his Chevy Blazer. Gomez got out of his truck to help Orr, who pointed to an area with crime scene tape. John told Gomez that this was the point of origin. He said he had found a delay incendiary device there.
So when Orr and Gomez arrived at the command post, Orr gave a statement to the press, and he told them all the details about it that arson investigators really would never reveal. He told the press things that only the arsonist would have known, and it would have been important to the investigation to keep these things from the public. So his behavior was starting to get erratic and more strange. And people are starting to notice.
He's leaving too many things unanswered, and just suspicious things that you really can't totally ignore or write off.
Sure, but they did write them off for a bit.
They tried, they did, yes. So Glendale Detective Robert Masucci told Orr and Gomez that he was there to help arson investigators interview any witnesses who lived in the apartment building across from the fire's origin area. One woman reported she had seen a man standing across the street near the origin area before she saw the fire. She described the man as 5'10", with dark hair and a mustache, wearing khakis. The man had a white or tan car, she added. Now, John Orr hadn't spoken to this witness at all, but that sure sounds like a description of him and his car, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. This was kind of a description of John himself, but he was in the apartment and he just didn't really say anything to her at that point.
Right.
At 11 p.m., John drove Gomez to a residential street and said that they should do some surveillance looking for a suspect. When Gomez asked questions about the suspect's car, Orr seemed to be purposely vague. Then they left after an hour or so, and Orr told Gomez he would call him the next day. When Orr didn't call, Gomez called him. But Orr told Gomez that he had everything under control and that he had sent a copy of his report to the fire marshal. But Gomez checked, and he never did send a report to the fire marshal. So he was trying to blow off the investigation. Now, meanwhile, John Orr's partner, Don Yeager, had gone to the Fresno Symposium. But when he heard that Glendale was actually having the biggest fire in its history, he returned to the city. But when Yeager arrived at the command post and approached John Orr, Orr seemed kind of surprised and not real happy to see him. And Orr said to him that he had everything under control and that he was letting the police do the canvassing for witnesses. So pretty much telling Yeager to just butt out and not worry about it, which was weird. Because usually it was the arson investigators who talked to the witnesses themselves.
Yeah, this is how it works.
And it really wasn't something John would normally do, hand something over to the police, because he had this whole insecurity about the police to begin with.
He did, so it was unlikely.
Right. So Yeager decided that by himself he would do some canvassing for witnesses. But he couldn't find anyone who had been interviewed by the police, so the police definitely weren't doing any canvassing. Anyway, it was always done by the arson unit, so it was all very weird.
Well, yeah, I mean, here's again, Orr's telling him one thing and the opposite is true.
Right, exactly.
Now, the following day, Orr spoke again with Yeager and told him that he had found a possible delay device made from a butane lighter. But Yeager felt that he was investigating the fire on his own. Orr had only written a report of reasons that the fire had spread and what had been damaged, but he really hadn't done any investigative work.
No, it was very bizarre, and Yeager really felt that he needed to be pushing Orr to investigate, which wasn't normal.
That's a strange situation.
Really is. And remember, he didn't go to the conference, and all the fires started back at Glendale. And when he went to the conferences, there were a rash of fires near the conferences. So it's all falling together.
Starting to, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, Orr seemed to have other things beside the College Hills fire that he was working on. Yeager went to the fire marshal and complained that his partner was overburdened and needed to be freed up to help with the fire investigation. But the marshal told Yeager that Orr was assigned only to the College Hill fire and was not asked to work on anything else. I had even been given clearance for overtime and anything else needed. So that's confusing. I mean, Orr tells him he's doing all this other investigative stuff, and the fire marshal says, no, his only job is this one fire.
Right, so once again the facts are contradicting what John Orr is saying.
Totally.
So yeah, Yeager's really confused, but when he returned to Orr, Orr said that the fire marshal was wrong. There was no cause and no origin report written on the fire either. Orr had written a report of damage and some general ideas on how maybe the fire had started, but nothing else was done. So the way Yeager saw it is Orr was treating the fire as if it had been an accident or a simple act of God, instead of an arson fire, which they pretty much knew it to be. It's too bad he didn't get Orr and the fire marshal in the same room and confront him and try and clear this up.
That would have been an interesting conversation, right?
Sure would have, yeah.
Now, this fire was a disaster. And the fortunate thing was that no human lives were lost. But 65 homes had been damaged or completely destroyed. People lost their pets. They lost their family memorabilia. It was just a horrendous fire. And the only thing that kept criticism off the fire department was that nobody had been killed.
Right, yeah.
So John Orr used Yeager's concerns about the investigation against him. He spoke with the fire marshal and told him that he thought Yeager was abrasive and unstable. He was hot-headed and he irritated people. Now the marshal decided he wanted Yeager to stay on until the end of the year, and then he would transfer him back to the firehouse.
Sure, so Orr's trying to get rid of him, probably because he knows he's on to him.
Yeah, he's suspicious that things are going to start happening, so got to get him out of there.
Right. So in December of 1990, John Orr was on his third partner in the arson unit. He was earning a good salary. Also, his fourth wife had a good job at Warner Brothers Studios, and he was feeling like he had the respect of his peers. Another good thing in his life was that his novel was coming along quite nicely. But then the Los Angeles area began having a series of arsons, and these were unlike any before. By March of 1991, the LA area had had 19 arson attempts in retail stores, and these were during the day when the stores opened and filled with people. So this started on December 10th of 1990 at the People's Department Store, not far from John Orr's residence in Eagle Rock. He had a new partner now, Joe Lopez, who was eating lunch when Orr told him that he had to go home to check on his dogs. He said his older dog was dying and John needed to take him outside or clean him up because he was losing control of his bladder and bowels. But it was soon afterwards, around 1 p.m., when the People's Store caught on fire. This was a busy time of day at the store, and the store was filled with Hispanic women and their small children. In the curtain display area, a woman saw flames rising up about 4 to 5 feet. Then another shopper saw the flames hitting the ceiling, and this was terrifying for her because she was looking for her children. Many of the children had been allowed to go to the toy department as their moms shopped for their more practical bargains. This was kind of a bargain store, and it was frequented by women with children, specifically Hispanic women. 2 employees there, Ana Ramirez and Maria Chavez, began helping to gather up the kids and leading them to the exits. So thank God there was some cooperation there, because miraculously the children and their mothers all escaped and no one was injured. But this was a big blaze. The roof actually collapsed from the fire, and this building burned pretty much to the ground.
So it's a wonder there weren't injuries or fatalities.
Oh, there could have very easily been. Yeah, definitely.
John Orr claimed that he had seen a column of dark smoke coming from the store as he was arriving at his house to check on his dog. He said he could tell it was a major structure fire. He had his video camera, which he carried in his SUV, so he raced to the store and recorded the fire.
Yeah, so that was another odd thing about him, is he liked to film fires. But of course he'd say it was for his classes and research, so nobody really questioned that.
Right. Plus that's his job. He's a fire investigator.
Sure, but I don't know if that would mean that he'd just come across seeing these fires when he's not called to them or anything. There are a lot of coincidences of him coming across fires, for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that same week, a fire broke out at Mort's Surplus, and that was just 2 miles from a woman friend who John Orr was visiting that day. So even though he and the fourth wife were supposedly happy, he was still womanizing.
So it would seem.
So this fire started in a stack of cardboard boxes, and this was another one that quickly climbed up to the ceiling. John would say that he was dropping off his woman friend's child when he heard about the fire over his radio. He said he saw smoke rising into the sky, so he sped to the scene, and he filmed that fire on his camcorder.
Then an arson investigator from the Burbank department arrived at Mort's Surplus just in time to see the roof on fire and about to cave in. No one was seen at the area of origin just before the fire, So it was also believed to have been started with a delayed incendiary device. Then the very next day, in North Hollywood, a builder's emporium store had a fire originating from a shopping cart full of pillows. Employees were able to put the fire out, but a cigarette, 2 matches, and a rubber band were found with the pillows. On the afternoon of December 17th, another store was damaged by a fire that broke out in a blanket and comforter display. This was noted also to be suspicious in nature.
Yeah, so on December 26th, which is the day after Christmas, the biggest shopping day of the year, Sherman Oaks in the San Fernando Valley was a cluster of suspicious fires. The first one was at 11:45 a.m. at a Bed Bath & Beyond, and it originated in a shelf of throw pillows. The sprinklers did go off and it was extinguished. But 4 blocks down the road, a Pier 1 Imports and a Stroud's Linen Warehouse had 2 fires at just about the same time, within a few minutes of each other, right after noon. And the Pier 1 fire was quite fierce. It had flames coming out under the mezzanine, and a bunch of shoppers had to run for the exits, yelling about the fire. This one burned right through the roof. The Stroud's Linen Warehouse fire was so intense that the metal beams in the ceiling lost their hold, and that roof caved in.
Again, nobody was hurt or injured or dead.
Which is amazing.
Absolutely amazing.
Yeah. Arson investigators from Los Angeles interviewed 13 witnesses. 2 security guards from a nearby drugstore reported seeing a medium-sized white male with slicked-back black hair, wearing a purple shirt and a black jacket, between 35 and 39 years old. They believed he had soot on him when he was seen just before the Stroud's fire. So this description was broadcast to all of the LAPD.
And later that day, another drugstore employee reported to arson investigators that he had seen the same man in a black jacket looking into Stroud's window. The following weekend, Sunday the 30th, the arsonist struck again. The first fire was at National Store near Dodger Stadium. This one was started in pillows and polyfoam. And less than an hour later, there is a fire at Crystal Promotions, and this one started into a display of plastic decorative items, like plastic flowers and that kind of thing. Both fires caused extensive damage, but the structures were saved, and no one was injured.
So in 1991, John Orr was really making progress on his novel. It was about an arson investigator turned serial arsonist, and another arson investigator who was committed to catching him. So the idea was that these 2 very similar men had taken opposite positions because of psychological triggers in the arsonist's life. So very interesting.
Yes, right? Truth is stranger than fiction, as they say.
Yes, or fiction isn't always fiction. A lot of truth kind of bleeds into fiction.
Sure. Well, you write about what you know about, right?
Sure, write what you know. That's right.
On March 3rd, 1991, the southern districts of Los Angeles became targeted. First fire, about 1:30 in the afternoon, was at a thrifty drugstore in the Wilmington region. Now, there were over 100 shoppers inside that store, and you can imagine the chaos as they ran for the exits. The fire came from between 2 stacks of pillows and hit the ceiling like a large mushroom. And as firefighters worked to put out that fire, another thrifty drugstore in San Pedro was burning just after 2 p.m. That fire, too, had started in a stack of pillows.
Yeah, then just 2 weeks later, on March 19th, there was a fire at a Goodwill store in North Hollywood. This one started with burning mattresses. Then just 20 minutes after the Goodwill fire, a house of fabrics nearby had a fire coming from a display of foam rubber pads. 3 days after that, a Pier 1 store on Hollywood Boulevard had a fire started on pine shelving that was stacked with throw pillows. So there's such a clear pattern here.
It's becoming more and more clear, isn't it?
It is, definitely. John Orr's new partner, Joe Lopez, took a weekday off at the end of March, and on that same day, there were 5 fires within a 2.5-hour time span in Lawndale, Redondo Beach, and Inglewood.
At the D&M yardage in Lawndale, it had been a slow day. Employee Linda Zito saw a man in the store who she described as white and middle-aged. Great description. She asked him if she could help him, and he asked her if they carried camouflage material. She said, "No, we don't." But the guy didn't leave. He continued to roam around the store. When he finally left, about 20 minutes later, a display of draperies on a foam display was on fire. And the fire was on the roof within a minute, and that entire building ended up being destroyed.
Well, you can see how fire would move very quickly there. If you have a display made of foam and then it has draperies hanging from it, I can't think of much worse.
Good material.
Yeah. Then, less than 2 miles away and less than half an hour later, a customer at Stat's Floral Supply saw a display of styrofoam products with a piece of yellow-lined paper that was smoldering. So the customer grabbed the paper and an employee put the paper out by pouring water on it. But inside of the paper, there was a cigarette butt and 3 matches attached to it by a rubber band.
20 minutes later, half a mile away, a thrifty drugstore had a fire in a display of patio cushions. Then, just a few minutes later, a J.J. Newberry store had a fire in a pillow display. Then the last fire that day was at an Inglewood Pick and Save, and it too originated in a stack of pillows. So we've had, half a dozen more fires? There are more?
Yeah, and these are just examples. There were more.
Yeah.
But these are just some days that had some really heavy sprees and just so many similarities, right?
Right.
But the fire at D&M Yardage had caused over $1 million in damage. So this justified involving the ATF. And when they first arrived at what was left of the D&M store, they really hadn't connected this fire to others throughout Los Angeles. But after they heard about the other 4 fires that day and the times that the alarms were set off, then they believed that all the fires were the work of a serial arsonist. So the day after the fire spree, arson investigators from the LAPD and ATF went to the Redondo Beach Police Department to see the incendiary device that was found at Stat's Floral Store. The investigators believed that this arsonist was a pyromaniac, someone with a compulsion to set fires. So they called their task force the Pillow Pyro Task Force.
And they had a list of 17 recent fires to investigate. These had all happened in the middle of the day, all in retail stores. The delayed devices found were unusual, in that some of them had a piece of yellow paper, others didn't. The arsonist had added the paper in order to get enough heat and flame. After the task force had their first meeting, an investigator from the state fire marshal's office approached them and told them about a similar series of fires, one in 1987 and one in 1989. He also shared the information about Marvin Casey, remember him? Believing that the arsonist was a firefighter and that he had a good fingerprint from one of the fires.
Right, so by April the 1st, the task force had a list of 29 fires they believed had been set by the Pillow Pyro, and they took a trip to Bakersfield to talk to Captain Marvin Casey. So he's starting to be acknowledged.
Starting to be.
Special Agent Howard Sanders of the ATF was assigned to hand-deliver flyers about the Pillow Pyro to all of the local arson investigators, and one of his deliveries was to the Glendale Fire Department, where he met with John Orr and his partner Joe Lopez. The task force members returned from their trip to Bakersfield with a photo of the fingerprint that had been found on the yellow-lined paper. It wasn't of much interest because it had already been through the automated systems, though, in 87 and 89. But they decided to run the print through again in case the arsonist had been arrested for anything between 89 and 91 and was maybe now in the list.
I think that's a reasonable idea. So the photo of the fingerprint was put on a scanner linked to the fingerprint computer input terminal. Came back with a score of how well it matched a fingerprint already in the files. So this scanning system differed a little bit from the one used by Casey, in that it had fingerprints of all county law enforcement officers, and of anyone who had ever applied for a law enforcement job. Now this included someone who had applied for a job with the LAPD 20 years earlier, John Orr.
Right, so now we're getting somewhere. On April 17th of 1991, the sheriff's laboratory called the Pillow Pyro Task Force, complaining that the investigators had mishandled the evidence. The yellow notebook paper had been touched by John Orr's left ring finger, so they thought, what the heck's going on with that?
Yeah, why is he handling stuff?
Sure.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Though most of the investigators who heard about this fingerprint match were shocked and even sickened and depressed. Some couldn't even believe it. A fire investigator who's an arsonist.
It's striking, yeah.
So the task force moved forward with the investigation slowly and carefully, hoping that there could be some legitimate reason for Orr's fingerprint to be on that piece of paper.
Sure, I mean, there were some very unlikely scenarios that investigators thought of, including that maybe Orr had stopped to help firefighters in Bakersfield in case he had forgot to mention that he had been there. Or maybe he had left his legal pad of paper at a nearby diner or something, and the real arsonist had picked it up and used it. Also, they wondered how the fingerprint specialist in 1989 hadn't been able to match the latent print to John Orr's fingerprint card, because that had been an error.
Oh, it certainly had. So the U.S. attorney was brought into the investigation, and there was still a lot to do before John Orr could be arrested. So they met with Marvin Casey, and he told him that they had a promising lead on the fingerprint.
Sure, but they weren't going to tell him about John Orr yet. They were being careful. So first what they had to do was establish the chain of evidence. And this meant talking to everyone who had anything to do with the collection, storage, packaging, moving, anything to do with that incendiary device. And by the end of the day, the investigators were satisfied that no outsiders had touched that evidence. So Orr was investigated, and they watched him for months. In April, he was followed as he drove to the embassy suites in San Luis Obispo for a conference. On Monday, April 29th, Orr attended a training session. Afterwards, he drove to the Thrifty drugstore. An ATF officer followed him inside, being well aware of the Thrifty store fires in Wilmington, Redondo Beach, and San Pedro. So John Orr didn't smoke, but he purchased 2 packs of Marlboro Lights at the store. The task force supervisor arrived in San Luis Obispo on May 1st, pretty much sure that John Orr would be trying to burn down a store on his return trip to Los Angeles after the conference.
Well, that would fit his style.
Yes.
So John Orr left his hotel room the morning of May 3rd. No cigarette butts were left behind in his room, and no one had seen him smoke at all during the conference. So he's driving down the road with surveillance following him and the tracking device on his car. Now he pulled over into a parking lot and walked to the rear of his car. So he had seen the tracking device under his bumper. Aha. He sped to the local police station and informed the police that he believed he had a bomb strapped beneath his car. But he refused to allow the police to contact a bomb disposal squad. And instead he went back to his car and drove it to their explosives disposal range. Can't see how they allowed him to do that, but anyway. John told the police that he was kind of a bomb expert himself, and he would be fine driving the car to the range.
Yes, so of course his behavior here is very odd.
Very odd.
And in the time it took him to reach the range, the task force had talked to the police and they'd come up with a story. An officer removed the device from John Orr's car and told him it was an inert, bogus bomb and promised to have it checked out for him. The officer thought that Orr had believed his story, but probably not. Orr took pictures of the device before he left. Then he returned to his hotel that day and attended the remaining training sessions. Then his wife came to spend 2 days with him after the conference ended. On May 5th, he returned home with his wife, so the task force was very disappointed. They weren't sure if he was on to them, but he actually was. They would find out later that he knew he was being watched as a suspect. Plus, that behavior would be strange for someone who was innocent to act that way, right?
Oh, you're right.
Wouldn't you say something to someone in the police or the fire department about that?
Well, sure. Especially a guy with Orr's personality. It's just not something he would let lie.
Yes, very strange.
So Orr called the bomb sergeant in San Luis Obispo 2 days later to see if he had examined the bomb. The sergeant told him he had. It's just an empty box. Probably somebody's idea of a joke. So he thought that Orr bought the story. but some in the task force thought that Orr was onto them.
Yeah, he definitely was. I mean, the surveillance continued, but they started to be able to tell that Orr was aware of it. He'd be driving along casually and suddenly race across several lanes of traffic to turn onto a random street. But still they couldn't be sure if he knew he was being followed because he was already known to be a very erratic driver. But since the task force's first meeting in late March, there had been no arson attempts in the Los Angeles area, so they concluded that Orr's knowledge of the task force even existing had been enough to keep him from setting more fires.
A photograph of Orr was shown to witnesses from the fires, and an employee from the People's Department store recognized him as a customer who was in the store a couple of times in the weeks before the fire. And a former employee of the D&M yardage store also picked John Orr from a sheet of photos, and she said that he had been in the drapery section of the store about 15 minutes before the fire broke out. By June, Orr had completed his novel, and he sent it off to a New York literary agent. The California Conference of Arson Investigators was holding a summer session from July 31st to August 2nd. Orr was registered to attend. Now, the task force was going to keep an eye on him, but they decided not to use a tracking device at this time.
Yeah, so on the first day, Orr checked into the Holiday Inn, and the next day at 2:30 p.m., he left the seminar and didn't come back. At 3 p.m., an ATF agent was parked near the convention center when he saw a large cloud of black smoke, and in a trash can he saw pieces of foam and cigarette butts on fire. This was small, and he was able to put it out with a fire extinguisher from his car, but he kind of saw it as maybe John Orr was playing with them.
Oh, definitely.
But the rest of that conference was uneventful. Just before 9 a.m. on August 2nd, Orr checked out of the hotel, and he checked under his bumper before he drove home. By this time, Orr's fourth marriage was in trouble. He was having an affair with this woman who he'd been seeing for a while, and this had gotten so serious that even this woman's child was calling him Dad.
Okay.
And at this point, he was really waiting to hear back about his novel as well. The LA Sheriff's Department had a new device called a teletrack, which they decided to try out on John Orr. This device could relay information every 5 seconds to a receiver screen, so they waited until his work car was in for service and had the device installed beneath the dashboard where he wouldn't come across it. But in the meantime, the task force was continuing to interview witnesses as well. A review of Orr's personnel file at the Glendale Fire Department showed that he had been scheduled to work on each day a fire had happened between December 1990 and March 27, 1991. However, he was not at any of the fire scenes, so he had been alone and unaccounted for. Also, Joe Lopez had been in training or had taken the day off on the days when the arsons occurred. So the likelihood of that is pretty slim.
Pretty slim indeed.
Can't be a coincidence.
No. So the time to arrest Orr is getting closer. To assure that Orr could not have touched the notebook paper that Casey had collected back in 1987, Casey had to be let in on the investigation of Orr. Then when an ATF agent called to talk to Casey, he felt that he was finally vindicated. He was right all the time in terms of who the perpetrator was.
Yeah, he felt sure it was one of the arson investigators, and he had been right.
So the task force became aware of Orr's novel, and they learned that it was about a fireman who was also a serial arsonist. So they decided that it would be a good idea to try to read it.
You think? I think that's probably a no-brainer. But how were they going to get a hold of it? They had to be a little tricky about that.
Right. John had called the fire department to ask if there were any firemen there named Stiles. That was the name of the character in his book, and he didn't want to get sued for using anyone's real name. So the task force knew of a retired arson investigator who was also a writer. They had him call Orr and offer to read his manuscript. So this got Orr all excited, and he sent a copy overnight to the writer. Then when the task force read the manuscript, they were a bit shocked, but definitely happy to see that Orr was writing about actual fires that they are investigating.
Well, yeah, for example, one fire in his book had occurred at Cal's hardware store in a community south of Pasadena, and in the novel, 5 people had died in the fire, One was a little boy named Matthew. Now remember, at Oll's hardware store in 1984, 4 people had died in a fire, and one of them had been a 2-year-old boy named Matthew. So just striking similarities there.
You got it. The task force brought in behavior analysts who profiled serial arsonists for the FBI. Orr was determined to be an organized serial arsonist who didn't just want to start a fire, but wanted it to be the best possible fire to suit his needs. So fires set in foam material would likely give him bigger, faster fires. And retail stores open for business would be one of the most risk-filled places, which would appeal to him. Got to have that little kick of adrenaline, right?
Well, yeah, I think another bonus for him in that was that these stores were frequented by women. He definitely had issues with women. I mean, not only could he not be monogamous or faithful to a woman, but later on his former partners would be interviewed and they would say that he wanted to tie them up. He had threatened them with guns while having sex with them. So he did have a hatred of women. And it really makes me think of these fabric stores where there are a lot of mothers and children that he seemed to focus on. So I think it was more than just the materials. I think part of it were the people that he wanted to frighten and even injure or kill.
Oh, probably. Don't you think?
I think so.
Yeah.
According to the analysts, organized serial arsonists are usually employed. They project an image of authority. They are also very cocky about their professional life. Of all the serial arsonists that they had studied, none were monogamous. The serial arsonist is like other violent offenders, though, because they have no conscience, they're egocentric, manipulative, and they have a compulsive need for excitement. So it was pretty striking that I read about violent offenders and serial killers, and 70% of them have set fires in their youth. Yeah. So much like torturing and killing animals.
It's one of those red flags.
Yes, exactly.
So the teletrack had been installed and was being monitored by Friday, November 22nd, 1991. At about 3 p.m. that day, a Burbank fire inspector was driving to his office when he saw a column of smoke rising into the sky. He drove toward it and heard on his radio that firefighters were being dispatched to Warner Brothers Studios. So a set of a house, barn, sawmill, and chicken coop were fully engulfed in flames. This set was used for the TV series The Waltons. Now, at first, investigators believed it was an electrical fire, but then they saw burn patterns that looked like there had been a flammable liquid poured there. So Captain Steve Peterson had less than 2 years as an investigator, and he decided to call in Captain John Orr, who had taught an arson investigation course that same day that Patterson had attended. Orr returned Patterson's call. He said that he was coincidentally just a short distance away, having dinner with a friend. Patterson waited 15 minutes. When Orr hadn't shown up, he called him again. Orr told him, "No, I'm already on the set, checking it out." So this confused Patterson. Orr had asked him for directions, but he was inside the fire scene.
So that's weird.
Very weird. But Patterson let it go. He didn't want to question Orr because he looked at him as, a teacher and a mentor.
Sure.
So later on, Orr reported that he had given Joe Lopez the afternoon off. Then he had to go to the school of his woman friend's daughter for a parent-teacher meeting. And the school's only a mile from the fire. Orr said he had seen smoke and heard the call over the radio. He had decided to go to the fire for a videotaping opportunity. But due to traffic, he hadn't made it there. Then Patterson called, and he did quickly drive over.
Yeah, but Patterson never learned from Orr that his wife Wanda actually worked at Warner Brothers, and that Orr had been there many times. So why was he asking Patterson for directions? He also didn't know that the studio director of security had seen John Orr go through the gate before 4 p.m. that day when the fire was fully raging. Also, John had stood for several minutes just watching the fire burn, according to the security guard. This was the first fire where Orr would be placed since the task force had been formed. But the teletrack hadn't helped. It showed him at Warner Brothers parking lot at 6:18 p.m., but that was when he came to assist Patterson. It didn't show him there when the fire had been started at about 3:30 p.m., so they didn't know if the device had malfunctioned or if Orr had used another car to go to the studio and set the delay device. If he was using another car, that meant that he did suspect there was a tracking device on his car, which wouldn't be surprising.
No, I mean, he's already found one.
Yeah, and he didn't think it was a bomb.
No, not in the least.
I mean, he was crazy and awful, but he was smart.
Then the next day, Gary Saito, a former Los Angeles Fire Department captain, was driving east on the Foothill Freeway, and he saw John Orr in his white car next to him. He honked and waved at John, who honked back. Saito knew that John Orr was a suspect in the Pillow Pyro investigation, so he watched Orr drive away, heading south. He had his son in the back seat note the time and location. It was 2:25 p.m. Then 15 minutes later, Saito saw a column of smoke, and he saw fire engines heading to where Orr had been coming from. John Orr now has been at the scene of the Warner Brothers fire, and he was seen all over the place at the 2 arson fires in Glendale. Task Force couldn't wait any longer to arrest him. His behavior was escalating, or seemed to be, and that would certainly put lives at risk.
Yeah, so Orr was finally arrested on December 4th of 1991, and the 350-page manuscript for his novel was seized by federal investigators when he was arrested. They also seized 40 videotapes and 70 audio tapes that Orr had made at dozens of fires. So here are some of the similarities between Orr's character in the manuscript and Orr himself, the actual arsonist. Both used a delay incendiary device designed to start a fire about 10 or 15 minutes after the device had been left in place. And in a draft of the manuscript, there is an incendiary device with a match attached to a cigarette put inside a paper bag, which is similar to Orr's matches attached to a cigarette and placed inside yellow-lined paper. Now, both started fires in retail stores located in Los Angeles during business hours, and both placed the device in combustible materials located within the store. Both had started a fire in a drapery section of a Los Angeles fabric store. Both had started fires in hardware stores. Both were firefighters, of course, and both were non-smokers. Both started fires in the same locations, while both the character and the actual arsonist had been traveling to or from these arson conferences. And one of them in the book had also been in Fresno.
So July 31st, 1992, Orr is convicted of 3 counts of arson in a 5-count indictment. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive terms of 10 years. He continued to maintain that he was innocent, but he did make a guilty plea in 1993 to 3 more counts of arson as a plea bargain on 8 more indictments.
Yeah, it was funny in the first trial how they found him guilty of 3 out of 5 counts, because both the prosecutor and the defense had conceded that all 5 fires were started by the same person.
Yeah.
But I guess they just felt there was reasonable doubt in a couple of fires, even though the defense had agreed that they were all started by one person. Now, the plea bargain he took because, it saved him a lot of time and a risk of more time in prison. But it wouldn't matter because in 1998, he was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder. And that stemmed from that 1984 hardware store fire. He was sentenced to life plus 20 years without the possibility of parole. At the time, his 23-year-old daughter testified in his defense to try and keep him from getting the death penalty. And it worked, but eventually she would be convinced that he was guilty as well.
She came around.
She did.
So we had lots of stuff we could look at for this case, this episode.
It's really a fascinating story.
Well, it really is. If you really want to get a good feel for things, read the book called Fire Lover by Joseph Wambaugh. Wambaugh is one of my favorite authors. He was a policeman in Los Angeles who decided to become a writer. How about that?
Yeah, and he wrote on another case that we covered, didn't he?
He's written a ton of books. His first book was The New Centurions, about policemen in Los Angeles.
So some are fictional and some are based on true stories.
He does both fiction and nonfiction.
Sure. Well, it's also interesting to read the book written by John Orr. He actually wrote 2 books.
Yeah, the other book was called Point of Truth, and this was about his trial, his unfair trial.
Yeah, how unfair everything was.
Yep.
There are also things to watch. There's an episode on the PBS series Nova. The episode's called Hunt for a Serial Arsonist. Also, A&E Network's true crime series Cold Case Files had an episode on this case, Diary of a Serial Arsonist. And Forensic Files, Season 9, Episode 21, had a story on this case called Point of Origin.
And don't forget the HBO movie in 2002 called Point of Origin.
Yeah,
it's
not
one
very
of those
good.
Based on.
Yeah, Ray Liotta. It's not great.
No, it wasn't.
No, you certainly don't learn much about the case from it, because it does veer off quite a bit from the facts.
Yes, it does.
So let me take a minute here to sell ourselves. If anyone out there has considered being a tie grabber, I'd like to encourage you to go ahead and do it. We've had a lot of fun with our episodes for members only lately. For example, we recorded a Halloween special just for our members, where we talked about the Halloween movies from 1978 and 2018. And we had fun sharing some of our memories of Halloween and scary movies, and we gave the movies our really unprofessional reviews.
Totally unprofessional.
We now have well over 30 members-only episodes available, so to join in on the fun, just go to tiegrabber.com and click on subscribe. We have options now where you can join with monthly, quarterly, or annual plans to save a little money. And another new feature is that our new members get to choose their welcome gift. You can choose to get a snifter, which is Dick's favorite beer drinking glass, a steel wallet-sized bottle opener that fits right in your wallet, or a set of 4 coasters. And of course, you'll also get some stickers and magnets and other little gifts in there. Do you have feedback for us? If you do, you can leave us a voicemail by just going to tiegrabber.com and clicking on Leave a Voicemail. Or you can send us an email at truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com, or leave us a message on social media, on Twitter at tiegrabberpods, or on Instagram, or on Facebook as Tiegrabber Podcasts. We also have a group on Facebook that you're welcome to join that's called True Crime Brewery Fan Discussions Page. Many of our listeners are members and are active there, and Dick goes in and says a few words here and there. Okay, Dick, let's do feedback. What do you have for us today?
Today I have 2 voicemails and 1 email. 2 voicemails I wanted to play them both. So I did. The first one's from Julia, and she has a case suggestion and also a question.
Hi, Jill and Dick. This is Julia calling from Perth. I think you guys are just incredible, and I wish I could listen to a podcast every single day, but I know that's not possible. I forgot the name of the episode, but the lady's name was Hannah. She was accused of drowning her children along with her partner, and it reminded me of an incident, and I would just love you guys to do this case. It was on a fellow called Garforth, who drowned his 3 sons on Father's Day here in Australia. 2 really good books called This House of Grief and On Father's Day. Cindy Gambino was the mother, and for a very long time she believed her ex-husband Garforth that he'd had a coughing fit and inadvertently driven the car into a dam not far from her house as he was dropping the boys back on Father's Day, but he was subsequently found guilty of deliberately killing them. It's just absolutely horrific, and it just reminded me, I was reminded of this case when I read the Hannah one. So you guys are just magnificent. Keep up the brilliant work. I do have a question for Dick, though. What is your favourite all-time ever beer? I would love to know. All right, guys, keep up the fantastic work, and I'd love you to do an episode on this case if you get time. All right, bye now from Perth. See you later.
Great. Thanks, Julia. You can always get your voicemail played if you ask Dick about his favorite beer.
Well, that wasn't the reason I played it.
No, it was a great voicemail.
Yeah, so this was a case that occurred in 2005. And the guy's name, and I might be butchering his last name, is Farquharson. I'm not sure what Julia was saying, but it didn't sound like Farquharson.
Well, it was Australian.
I gathered that.
Okay.
But the story is the same. He and his wife were apart. He saw his 3 boys on the weekends. And he was apparently driving his car. And as Julia said, he had a coughing fit, and his car crashed into a dam. and his 3 children were killed. Now, he ended up, after investigation, he was accused of murder and convicted, but this verdict was overturned. He then went to retrial, was again convicted, sentenced to life in prison, and serving a minimum of 33 years. So right now he's in jail. And there's a really good book on this case called This House of Grief, The Story of a Murder Trial, and it's by Helen Garner. So if we decide to do this, I'll be delving into that book.
Were you able to find the book?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, great. It's a nice title of the book, This House of Grief.
Isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I wonder about this kind of case what the motive was. Was it to save on child support? Was it one of those awful revenge things to get at their mother? So whether we do it or not, I would like to read the book.
We shall.
Okay.
And then in response to Julia's question about my all-time favorite beer, my flippant remark is it's whatever beer I'm presently drinking. But if I think about it, I'd have to say my all-time favorite beer, and you could probably guess this one too.
Oh, I know what it
Is a beer called Curio, brewed by Allagash Brewing in Portland, Maine. Phenomenal beer. It's a Belgian triple. Just everything you could say good about it is good about it. In fact, it's such a great beer. I served it at our wedding, and it was met with great appreciation by my beer drinking friends.
All right, great.
Okay, that's that. I'm done talking about beer.
No, I think that's great. She wanted to know and you told her, and of course I knew that was your favorite.
I know. Then we have a voicemail from Anne, who you might remember her leaving us like a 4-part or 5-part voicemail because she couldn't stop talking.
Oh, yeah, I remember her.
And we used one of those parts. So this time she said, I'll be brief, and she was under 3 minutes.
Yeah.
And she had a suggestion and also a comment.
Hey, Jill and Dick, this is Anne. I called once before and left like 5 million voicemails because I am not succinct like Dick. I ramble on and on and on. So I'm going to try to do better this time. This time I wanted to just give y'all a little bit of feedback that I have been going back and listening to old episodes just because I love y'all so much and I love your company when I'm working around the house. I've been spending a lot of time alone lately. And it's just nice to have my buddies Jill and Dick with me while I'm doing chores and things like that. So I keep hearing on some of the older episodes that y'all used to talk about maybe doing an update episode where you round up information, current information about appeals and about just different convictions and things like that that have happened on cases that you've covered in the past. And unless I've missed it, I don't think y'all have ever done this. I think it is such a great idea, even if it's just one that you do for the Tie Grabber members. I know I personally, as a member, would just find that so fascinating. Some of the cases that y'all have covered over the years have just been really, they get in your brain and they just kind of don't leave. So I would love some updates on some of those. If y'all decide to do that, you'll definitely have a listener in me. Also, I just wanted to say, Jill, I agree with you. Every time I listen to a case about a bitter custody battle and one of the parents murdering the children, it makes me so crazy I want to lose my mind, especially since I'm currently going through a divorce and live separately from my husband, who's, still technically my husband, but I just can't imagine. And I feel so blessed and so grateful that my husband and I both, care mostly about my daughter and we share her equally. And it's just, I can't imagine doing it any other way. So thanks so much for everything. Looks like I am running out of time. I'm your rambler. I will keep listening and would love an update episode. So I hope that y'all get around to doing that. Thanks again for everything you do. Bye.
Well, thanks, Anne. Anne's great, huh?
She does good voicemails.
She's very kind to us.
She certainly is.
So we have talked here and there about doing that update, and then I guess we just kind of forgot about it.
Yeah, when I listened to her voicemail, I said, we could do some update on the Chris Watts case.
Sure.
Because we've got some stuff on him. And the football coach in Texas Temple, right? David Temple?
Yep, that's another one. I'm sure there are several, though.
But he had a new trial and stuff. So, and I said, well, if I can come up with those two pretty quickly, there's probably more that we could get updates on. So if you want me to, I can look through old episodes and see if there's updates or new things that we might want to report on. Maybe we do an episode.
I think that's a fabulous idea, and I like the idea of doing it as a members only because you take over a lot of the research on those, so this could be your project.
It could be.
It could be.
Should I choose to accept?
Okay. Think about it.
Okay.
And this other thing about custody, and those are horrible cases, and it's just kind of a coincidence that our voicemail was about that kind of a case, about the 3 children with their father. This house of grief, right? Custody case.
Yeah. I mean, but that was Anne talking about it.
Right. I know. I'm just saying it's a coincidence that Anne brought that up, and we just had a suggestion for a similar case.
Right.
And then the case that we're working on for in the next week or two is about a mother who killed 2 of her children, and her husband and she were in a custody battle.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's just kind of a coincidence.
But yeah, we would certainly agree with Anne. Why take it out on the kids?
It's just sick. It's just something seriously wrong with these people.
It is.
But there have been cases of revenge where I just don't understand it. No, maybe we could get some psychology on that because it makes no sense.
None whatsoever.
No. But thanks a lot, Anne. That's great.
Thank you. All right, one email, and this is from Nate. He's succinct also. I wonder if Dick and Jill would consider doing an episode on the case of Amber Hilberling. This was a woman whose husband fell through a window in their 25th floor apartment building. And obviously he died because he fell 25 stories. Amber claimed that they were fighting, and she pushed him because he was attacking her. This was self-defense.
Sure.
And he went through the window and fell to his death.
Yeah, so when you were reading this email from Nate, you called me into the room and we chatted about it a bit. And I remembered seeing a Dateliner of 48 Hours on this case. Fairly recent case, right? Did this happen in the past 5 years or so?
Within the last several years, right.
Right. Yeah, so I am definitely interested in that.
Because Amber Hilberling was tried and convicted of second-degree murder. And then 3 years into her sentence, she was found dead in her cell. And she was an apparent suicide by hanging. So if it's a self-defense thing, and she's so devastated at being found guilty, she dies.
Yeah. Now, was the window open, or did he go through glass?
Through the glass.
Gee, I wonder if anyone sued the apartment for letting that happen.
There was a suit. I think it was dropped or something, but the family, Amber's family, did sue.
Sure.
The apartment complex or owners or whatever.
Well, and I would think the young man's family would sue. I would think those windows, when you're 25 feet up, should be...
You should be able to bang on them a little bit.
Shouldn't be falling through them, right? No, that's terrifying.
And there was a history of domestic abuse in the marriage, so...
On her part or his? Or by both of them?
Maybe both, but
maybe.
She stated she was in an abusive marriage.
Yeah, well, if you're someone like me who's deadly afraid of heights...
Well, you wouldn't be living in a 25th floor apartment to begin with.
No, I don't even like to go in a hotel above the 10th floor. Although I don't know why it would matter. If I fell from 10, I'd be just as dead as if I fell from 25, but...
Yeah, well, it's just the thought of the thing.
Just the thought of it, yeah. I like to be on the first floor, honestly. The first floor, I feel safe being on the ground. It's how I like it. But I think that's a good suggestion, Nate. Thank you very much.
It is a good suggestion.
And Nate is succinct. That's what I was thinking. You're so succinct. I bet if I had a partner like Anne doing my podcast, I wouldn't even have to write out much of an outline. We'd just start talking, and before you know it, it'd be an hour and a half. I don't know if we'd get to everything.
You just start talking. Yeah, if you wanted to cover the whole case, you'd have a 5-hour episode.
That's true. That's true. Your succinctness is probably a benefit in the long run.
That's how I look at it.
Okay. Well, thank you for your feedback, and thank you to everyone for listening.
Thanks,
we appreciate it very much.
So let's finish our beer, head home.
Let's close things up at the quiet end. It's getting late.
It is.
We'll see you next time at the quiet end.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
We'll save a seat. Bye.